I was at training when we were kids. Okay. It was rough because we didn't want to train. My dad kind of forced us to train. We didn't really want to train. We just wanted to like play around and be kids. But since he had seen so much craziness, like growing up in the Philippines and then coming here, because my dad and PAMANA TUHON, they were the guys that if you couldn't call the police, you would call them. They were those guys. So that reputation we knew about when we were young. So, you know, they were doing that kind of stuff, going after people and, you know, clearing drug corners, like those kind of stories. We would hear those stories, you know. So he had a certain view of the world, so he was trying to train us to be ready for that. So it was very, it was rough. You know, it would be child abuse these days. But it was rough. You know, like if you cried, they sent you to the kitchen with your mom and cook, you know, shit like that. Like if you were scared of bugs, he would put them on your face and you didn't have to show a reaction. You know, stuff like that. But it was hard training. Like you get hit, but you know, we didn't understand it because we were kids, and we try and tell parents not to teach their kids that way because you know, my dad was coming from a different background. My dad would tell us stories in the Philippines that the gangs would fight where he grew up in Manila, and he was poor, like super poor, and he would wait because they would fight with machetes, and he would when they were done, there would be like fingers and you know, stuff on the ground, and he would take the rings off the fingers, and he would take the wallets on because you know, when after a fight all the stuff lays on the ground, he would take it all out. I remember asking him, did they all know how to do Filipino martial arts? He goes, no, none of them knew how to fight. They just knew how to. They were just all killers. You know? They weren't good, but they were violent. He would always say that. I asked him, compared to the neighborhood now, always I said, this neighborhood is the same. You know, he would always tell us that we tried to bring you here to the United States for a better life, and I brought you a neighborhood that's the same. He said it's a little worse here because the people here are bigger. Like they're bigger people, they're stronger, and they have more access to guns. So I remember him telling us that. But when I was in Brooklyn, there was a kid that used to come around and steal my bike. So he'd come up to me, punch me in the face, take my bike. I'd find him a little bit. I was a kid, I was like 3 or 4 years old. And he was a bigger kid. He was like your age, right?
Maybe, yeah, maybe between us.
Between us.
Maybe. Just a
so he would just come up to me, you know, he'd grab it. Let him ride your bike. I was like, no, my dad doesn't want me to lend it. Bang! And they'd take it, and then I'd come up.
Oh, he hit you?
Oh, yeah, every time.
Oh, you know that.
And then one time, my brother would go get the bike. And then one time my dad was home when I said it. So my dad didn't know that it was happening. I would just go get my brother. And my dad said, who's this? And man, we went around the block, got the bike. But this time my dad made my brother fight him. And I was standing.
That's right. Yep.
He fought this guy. My brother had to fight him hand to hand.
Yeah.
He was like, oh, you're 9?
Yeah, maybe, no, not earlier than that, because
8, yeah.
by 9 we moved.
Yeah, so he was like 8. I'm like 4, something like 5, something like that. And I remember I was fighting, wrestling, punching him in the face. And then I remember he was trying to run away from you because you had his back.
Yeah.
And you were punching him in the face from behind, holding his, you know. And my dad was like, bite him! Or that's a bong bit him in the back, and that ended the fight, man. And bit him right on the spine, like in the skin of the spine. Ended the fight. The guy just stopped fighting. And then my dad gave him $5, sent him home.
Pretty fun.
That shit was always happening.
Is that why we moved to Queens? Because of the fight at the
Chinese.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why we moved in the middle of the year.
I was the same age.
Yeah. We had to because
They were coming
over
after
there.
him. We kept going after him. So after,
It wasn't just a. It wasn't a.
It was a bad neighborhood, so there was always fights going on in front of the house, and my father would always have us observe it.
All right.
That one time with the guy with the bat.
Yeah, just observe how. First of all, it's probably like trying to desensitize us to the environment because there's a lot of violence there. But he wanted us to watch how people responded when you would get into fights, how it would start, how the range would start, how it would end up, how quickly it turns physical,
How the attacks look like.
how the attacks look like, how a person looks when you get hurt or they get you get hurt a certain way. If they're stabbed, the reaction responses are different than when you get hit by a bat or when you get punched.
And targeting, he was always talking about the targeting was always, like if guys were getting hit with bats and they were still running around, the targeting was wrong.
Targeting was wrong.
Always wrong.
And you could tell who was trained and who was not based on those observations.
Yeah, and most of the stuff you see on the street is based on aggression and not skill. So when he would fight guys on the street, it was easy because he had the aggression and the skill.
Yeah.
So it's you gotta have that. You just can't be like the guy who has the aggression and no skill, because that guy can only beat people without skill who are scared.
Yeah.
Now, if you have skill and you have aggression, you trump those guys all day long.
So that's what he would say when people get hit, and especially with the people get hit with a bat or a weapon and nothing happens. What would he say? No target, right? That's his quote. No target.
Yeah, that time we
no
were,
target.
that
Like
time
meaning.
I think you were standing with Pop at the window, and I woke up because I could hear clunk, clunk, and I was like, "What is that sound?" And I woke up and I could see my dad and Dee at the window looking out, and I got up, and it was the sound of a guy getting hit in the skull with a baseball bat, but it was glancing off his shoulder, so he wasn't getting the grunt of it. It was a big guy. This guy was like 6'2" or something like that. It was a drug corner, like right outside the block, so I guess this guy stole something, and the enforcers were coming in to teach him a lesson. And he was a big guy. I remember that. He was a big dude, and the guy beating on him was not a big guy, but he had a weapon. Remember that?
Yeah.
And they were hitting him, they were punching him, and they were punching him. We were just watching, but I remember they were hitting him in the head. And my dad was like, "Yeah, see that? He's glancing it off his shoulder." And this was a big dude. He was just taking the shot. And then they laid him down on the ground, and they were gonna break his knees. Remember that?
Yeah.
And he was crying. No,
He's
no, like
begging.
he was begging, and it was the first time I heard begging. And I remember they wound up to hit him in the knees, and I turned my head away. My dad grabbed my head and turned it back and said, you got to watch this." At that point, the cops turned the corner, and then
Yeah, he was mentioned, like, what is it, like, skill enhances violence, but skill could also, like, de-escalate violence, but violence doesn't need skill. You know, but remember the fight in front of the house, like, it was the family, it was and the guy tripped on himself. Like, my father also talked about when you get into a fight, if you're not trained, you go to your gross motor skills, right? But when you see people who are not trained and you don't really study terrain or like those dynamics, how quickly it affects combat. So there was one when the guy was so concentrated on the guy in front of him. Normally when you would trip, you would just trip and catch yourself. But I remember the guy tripped and just fell straight back. It's almost as if he was spending so much time on what was in front of him. He couldn't concentrate on his basic, like, coordination. I remember he slipped and fell like a sack of potatoes.
and there was a whole training thing on as you approach a guy and you're about to fight, as you walk up to him, scan all the ground that's going to be behind you.
Yeah.
So you know, because it's not like you're going to fall, but you can make him fall. So there was a whole. He taught us like we had what we call the primary offensive pattern. It was the first targeting sequence that we learned when we were like kids. We only hit the kneecaps and the elbows and the hands because you're not fighting with sticks. You're fighting with like axe handles and pipes. You don't use like rattan sticks are for training. Like you spar with those when you don't want people to get like you don't want to hurt somebody really. You know, you might break something, but no one's like super damaged. Right? But you use like an axe handle. We use axe handles because the wood was indigenous to the U.S. If we get bahi at the wrong time of the year, it would break. It would warp and break. Like if you got them shipped over during the winter, because we saw bahi break on guys' heads like they were shattered like glass. So we started going to axe handles because they wouldn't break. And then pipes are good because you could block machetes with them, and that way you didn't have to worry about like all your blocks and stuff work. But he always talked about like the targeting has like you only got this, you only got like all of us here have chipped elbows from sparring matches with each other, chipped kneecaps because we were. So my brother had this gear when we were kids. It was there were metal caps like knee guards,
elbow and knees,
and elbows and knees. And my dad would train us with that, and we would only need to hit. He'd only count it if you heard the sound of the metal being hit. So clink, clink, the elbows, and he would train us when we were kids. We'd do like when we had training where he would just get bubbles, like the regular bubbles used for kids, and he would have us hit the bubbles with car antennas on the way down, like little hit little targets with little weapons. So we trained that all the time as a game. Who can get all the bubbles before they hit the ground with a car antenna? And then we do the same thing with finger jabs. We'd finger jab the bubbles and front kick them as if we're kicking kneecaps and popping eyes. So, same thing, like we'd have car antennas, and if it was the fall and the leaves were falling, we would have to hit the leaves with car antennas. Which is cool because later on we heard PAMANA TUHON taught his kids to use a whip the same way. It was actually pretty cool. They would hit the trees with a whip, and when the leaves fall, they would have to hit the leaves on the way down with a whip. That was pretty cool. We never learned how to use a whip, and that's why we thought it was cool, because we didn't know how to do that. It was a skill set we didn't have. But that's kind of like the accuracy training. And he would always say, if you got a guy in the kneecap right, always aim the second shot to the elbows, because they'd be falling and their heads would line up to the elbow. If you did it right, and you know when you hit the kneecap right, there's a feeling when if you're holding a pipe and you hit someone in the kneecap, if you hit them in the thigh, you know. Like if you hit the thighs, or like shin bones are good too, but if you're hitting the thighs and the calves, and you weren't doing anything to some of these guys on the street, man, they were pretty tough. You know, they're big boys, so you had to be super accurate. That's why the blades are nice.